Hello and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. For the last 6 years, European and Chinese think tankers have been meeting regularly behind closed doors to try to achieve better understanding, identify problems and agree areas for cooperation, and thrash out their differences. They held 6 joint events a year, at least 4 of them in person, alternating between Europe and China, with financial support of the EU. The last online session in this sustained dialogue took place this week. Overall, the project has brought together more than 1,000 participants during its 36 events, and produced 5 compendia featuring 60 papers with more than 650 policy recommendations from European and Chinese think tankers. So this is a good time to take stock of what it's achieved and where things go from here, especially since it comes at a time of gathering storm clouds in the economic and geopolitical relationship between China and the EU. It's perhaps remarkable that the think tank exchange has survived a series of bumps in the road in the EU-China relationship, starting with the COVID-19 pandemic, the tit-for-tat sanctions, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and growing concerns on both sides about technological sovereignty, security, and industrial advantage, and about trade and investment flows and obstacles. Today, I want to explore what European and Chinese think tankers talk about in those confidential exchanges, while respecting, of course, the ground rules of not identifying or quoting participants. All the leading Chinese foreign policy institutes participated in the sessions, and a cross-section of leading European researchers too. To what extent were participants able to go beyond official talking points and explore common ground? How were the results of the dialogue shared with the relevant actors on both sides? And have they had a perceptible influence on public policy? Well, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ling, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Relations in Beijing. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You've been a key participant in the dialogue, and Fabian, Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist at the European Policy Centre, who was one of the initiators of the exchanges and a regular visitor to China long before all of this began. Welcome to both of you. Dr. Ling, let me start by asking you, what were the main topics discussed in these exchanges, and what did you get out of the dialogue with European colleagues?
Yes, during 6 years of exchange, we actually covered a lot of issue areas. We not only talk about the general trends of China-EU relations, but we go into the days. We include a lot of specific issue area in our talks. For example, we have ever talked about the China-EU economic relationship, the possible cooperation in security area between China and the EU, and we talk about China-EU possible cooperation on the multilateral level. And most important for me, I think we have also touched the issue of narrative or a kind of perception issues. We explore what are the factors behind the perception gaps. So basically speaking, we covered almost all the issues related to China-EU relations. My personal experiences, I think the most important value or added value of this think tank interconnection or dialogue is we have established a strong link of networks that make us, always have the channel to communicate, whether there is an in-person event or not. that provide us the bridge for the communications. That's important for, I think, the think tanks to play the role in promote mutual understanding at the current context. And also, number two, I think it's important. Sometimes we disagree, but basically speaking, we really reached a kind of consensus that we could agree to disagree. And with that principle, we try to explore the opportunities for the cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Well, do the Chinese participants get the impression that your European counterparts follow a concerted narrative in discussions with you? Or do you perceive differences among the Europeans that reflect debates in Europe on how to deal with China's rise and its geopolitical and economic ambitions?
I don't think there is a clear yes or no answer to the question, because it's quite nuanced. It depends on the issues we talked. Sometimes I could sense there is a kind of a socialization process, I could say, that a lot of European think tankers held the same view as regards to the specific issues. For example, today the very popular narrative of the so-called overcapacity issue, the China shock, it seems the narrative has been widely used, and also there is a kind of common understanding among European think tankers. But as regards the way out of the current tensions, I think we could sense the different views. Some of the participants hold a more positive, or constructive, views. For example, promote more for dialogue instead of, the tit-for-tat tactics. And others may be considered as more forward views as regards to the current tensions. The very popular, point last we heard in Brussels recently, that's the so-called escalate to de-escalate. But there are also worries from European sides whether escalate could naturally need to de-escalate instead of long spiral of the tensions. So that is not a clear answer to the question.
Let me just reassure our listeners that we're talking about escalation in trade restrictions or measures, and we're not talking about any kind of military or kinetic escalation. But yes.
Sure.
Fabian, did you perceive nuances in Chinese thinking about Europe and the world that offer opportunities for commonality, for example, on trade or on the war in Ukraine or on global governance and international institutions?
Yes, absolutely. I think these exchanges are a very good conduit also for both sides to understand how the debate is developing. We have, in fact, done these exchanges now for around 20 years. So it's a long period in which we've also seen views and stances change. But what is also very important is that it is a forum where we can express what issues are high up on the agenda for us, how we perceive them, and then to have the exchange to find out how the other side sees it. And there, I think one of the very positive features of these exchanges is that we have not been afraid of raising contentious issues, raising issues where there are deep disagreements. But at times, there are, of course, also differences on the European side and on the Chinese side. It is not a monolithic exchange. If it was, there would be no value in this. We would just sit there, read out pre-prepared statements without having any real exchange.
Can you give us some concrete examples then?
Well, I think one of the concrete examples from the European side has been Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which clearly is a major concern for Europe. I think there clearly is a different relationship between China and Russia, but we've also had many exchanges on the implications for international law, the question of how we deal with the repercussions of this, whether there are possibilities of having China involved in some form of a ceasefire peace process. So while there are differences in the stance Europe takes and the stance China takes, it doesn't mean there cannot be a dialogue which looks at the different perceptions. And for example, one of the issues which I think both sides agreed on in this context was the clear condemnation of the use of nuclear weapons, which is something where there is very much a common interest not to have that form of escalation.
Dr. Ling, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think I agree with Fabian's view that through the dialogue, we have a better understanding of each other's concern. Sometimes we could hear that China underestimate the Ukraine war's issue, the importance to Europe. But through the dialogue, we made a clear point. China totally understand your concerns, but it's important also for Europe to understand Chinese positions because of, we are different standing, different relationship with Russia, different experiences with NATO, etc., etc. So through the dialogue, of course, we still, as we said, we still disagree in some specific issues, but we could have a better understanding of each other's concern.
So what did you see as the main benefit of the exchange? To what extent do the results of this exercise feed into Chinese policy thinking? Do you see signs that you and your fellow Chinese participants are able to influence European thinking about China and its policies?
This is a kind of two questions. The first one, how the kind of dialogue could be integrated into the Chinese policymaking process.
Yeah.
I think here we work in a think tank. One of our tasks is to provide policy recommendation paper to the policymakers. So through the exchange, we could bring their concerns back and integrate it into our policy recommendation paper. And also, secondly, we actually will be, consulted in the policy making process. So we also could through this channel to take the the exchanges, the results of our exchanges to the process. And I think from European sides, I don't know the exact answer how that kind of exchange could have the impact. But I like to mention one of the products of the exchange, that is the joint publications. I think Fabian know it very well. Each publication, we have the Chinese author and European perspective. So I think the publication could also, I wish, could have, be reached by the policymakers in Europe that have a better understanding what Chinese side think of the issues of their concerns. I don't know whether that will be integrated into the policymaking process, but at least it make it public, make it well known. That is also a kind of bridge to support, to promote the mutual understanding.
So same question as to Fabian. Can you give me a concrete example on the Chinese side where you think that this dialogue has had some perceptible impact on public policy?
I think it's important that we recognize that in the end we are think tanks, we are not the decision makers, but what we can do is provide landing zones. We can say this are the kind of policy solution which is politically feasible. On the other side, we can show each other the reaction functions. How does the other side react in particular areas? Where the points where they express that there is pressure, that they need to deal with it. And all of that we are, of course, transmitting to the policymakers, to the officials. In the end, it is up to them to decide how they take this forward. But I think not only in this relationship, we are actually seeing that think tanks play this role more and more on a global level. They have an important role to play to lubricate international relations at a time when there are a lot of problems, a lot of barriers in the formal processes which are there. And so I think it has been a very good process. I think if you ask for a concrete example, I would say, but it's only one among many, that Russia-Ukraine is a good example because it did transmit from a European perspective the importance of this, and that this is a security threat for Europe, regardless of what happens in the White House. And I think that is better understood on the Chinese side now. But there are many examples, and some of them I wouldn't want to go into detail because part of the usefulness of a process like this is that it is not in public and that we don't have to account for this in a political way. We can explore things, we can put things on the table, we can be innovative, and we can be very much solutions driven. And I think this is something we can also build on this dialogue. I would see this very much as a process, not as a single event, because we need to find solutions to the many challenges we have in the global commons, which after all, both China and the EU will have to play a role. It just simply is not feasible that the world functions without that.
Indeed. Well, Ling, you mentioned yourself, many people in Europe are now worried about what they call a China shock 2.0, with European manufacturing industries facing a severe challenge from state-subsidized Chinese exports of clean tech, batteries, electric vehicles, and other industrial goods, boosted by what many in the West say is an undervalued currency. Is there any concern among China experts that you may be somehow overplaying your geo-economic hand and driving Europe towards a trade war with restrictive measures? Whatever happened to Deng Xiaoping's dictum of bide your time, hide your strength?
Yeah, complicated issue and a very vivid example of the perception gaps. I surely know that you can sense about the so-called overcapacity China shock, but from our perspective, we really have a different understanding of that. We don't see overcapacity is the fault of China. We think we should put it in a broader picture. That is a part of the issue of the global imbalances for a long time. And as I was said in public panel last held in Brussels, if you think it in global level, I think we must have to point out the overconsumption in U.S. and underinvestment in EU, rightly pointed out by the G7 presidency. The President Macron has ever pointed out, and also the so-called China shock. Actually, fundamentally speaking, we see it's not China shock brings difficulties of European countries today are facing. We see that is a competitive issue EU has to solve by itself. If we look at the innovation rate, if you look at the welfare policy burden, if you look at the non-fulfilled integration of the single market, all of the problems have been rightly pointed out by the Darchi report. To address the issues. Of course, I could understand EU concerns, the kind of imbalances of so-called trade imbalances between China and Europe need to be addressed. But in which way? Whether we need dialogue channel to see a compromise from both sides to reshape another win-win cooperation framework, or we are in a kind of, tit-for-tat trajectory, because today is quite risky and worrying. EU seems are on the track to erect the barriers more in order to get more leverage to negotiate. But the kind of process itself can pose a huge threat to the healthy economic cooperations between China and the EU. And quite interestingly, you talk about Deng Xiaoping's by the time how to express that. But anyway, I think the kind of idea was put forward in the 1990s. Don't forget the background of that. That is the end of the Cold War. I think it seems that the former president worried about with the former Soviet Union, China would like to be the leader of the so-called the other bloc. So at that time, the key point is we will not to be another hegemon of the third world, and we should focus more on the Chinese internal development. And these two parts actually are not contradictory to each other. There is always misunderstandings in European countries. It seems that at that time we are accumulating power, and now is the time to be act as a hegemon. No, I think all of this is a whole story. That's to say how to balance our own development and the capability to take global responsibility. Yeah. So through all of the process, I think Chinese government try to have this kind of balance. Even today, I think we still hold the focus on our own development. We still have a lot of internal challenges. But at the same time, with the rising of China, we will definitely try to take more responsibilities. But there is a clear no to the kind of mindset. China will be another hegemon. That will not be the answer. That is why we have been clearly opposed to the idea of the so-called G2 of China and US to, take the leadership of China, of the world, because the Chinese government have a long history of advocating for multipolarity. That means the world affairs, the world challenges need global cooperation. Besides China, US, EU, Russia, those large powers. So that's my personal take on the issue you mentioned.
So Deng Xiaoping's wisdom, his advice, bide your time and hide your strength, still applies. And we should have a new balance, new balance between these two parts of the story. But it still are an integrated, wisdom. Just to follow up on my economic question, is there an awareness in China of the extent to which China's export successes are causing extraordinary anxiety among workers, trade unions in Europe, because they see the potential for massive job losses, apart from the question of government's concerns about whether they will still be able to be competitive? There's a human aspect which has, I'm sure, as in China, a political weight on the authorities if people are worried about losing their jobs.
Of course, there is a clear understanding about the anxiety and the fear from European side. But we also have the same worries as to the causes you cited about the fear and the worry. We today sense the complexity of the issue because it has been far beyond the pure economic issues, as you have mentioned. The issue has been highly integrated with the social stability and the political stability of European countries. That makes the issue more tricky to solve. From our point of view, I think the Chinese government and the enterprises are all open to dialogue for reshaping of the so-called win-win cooperation format. For example, the Prime Minister of Spain, when he visited China, he called for more investment in Spain. That will bring back the production there and also jobs and taxes. I think that is a kind of a new way. But for our perspective, it seems there is a kind of a contradictory, message sent out from European sides. The investment from Chinese companies are, experiencing more screening. That make they complain a lot or worry a lot about the business climate. So how to rebalance those factors together? That is really a challenge for the political wisdom and also the business, policy.
Well, thank you. Fabian, this particular commission-sponsored EU-China think tank exchange is coming to an end now at a tense moment in relations, as we've heard, between Brussels and Beijing, particularly on the trade front. How should the dialogue be taken forward now?
I think it's important to recognize that, yes, the funding phase has come to an end, but as has already been said, we have built networks which actually are going to continue to work, continue to also go into different areas. We're looking at a dialogue, for example, in the security field, which could be very interesting. So I don't think these exchanges are going to stop. But at the same time, one of the great benefits of this dialogue has been that we had a structure which enabled us to have very regular exchanges and to also have these exchanges in person. Of course, not during COVID, but for the rest of the period, there have been many trips because we recognize that finding these kind of common ways forward only happen when you see each other, when you are able to have that discussion also in each other's place. So that has been, I think, the importance of the facilitation of the funding, which has been going into these dialogues from the Commission. I think it is extremely valuable for both sides. This is also the reflection we had. As you mentioned, we had the last online meeting this week. There was no difference in the Chinese appreciation of the dialogues and the European appreciation of the dialogues. This is one area where we don't have to agree to disagree. We actually very much agree that this is something which should be taken forward. And I would really also reiterate the urgency to the Commission to keep this process going, to not delay the tender, because I think in the end, the more we can intensify this, the better at this moment in time. It's precisely when there are tensions that you need this dialogue more than ever.
Yeah. Well, there's one subject on which I think we can all agree to agree. That's all we have time for this week, but you can read more about the EU-China relations on the EPC website, www.epc.eu, including in the Brussels Economic Security Review, edited by my colleague Varg Volkmann. The EU and China think tank exchanges compendium with 12 contributions from prominent European and Chinese think tankers and academics will be published this week as well. The Language of Power will be back in 3 weeks' time, when we'll be discussing the outcome of the NATO summit in Ankara. Until then, I'll say thanks to my colleagues, Ivano Di Carlo and Simona Lusardi, for helping to prepare and record this podcast, and thanks to you for listening in.